The front door won't last much longer.
Niel, a black-skinned dwarf with a snow-white beard, said. Niel looked like most dwarves. He was short, stocky, and had more hair on his chin than on his head. He wore leather armor and carried a vicious-looking scythe.
I wonder how many of them there are.
Katrina, who was a metal creature with magical consciousness, nervously swung her pair of metal hammers around her, swatting at imaginary flies. She was dreadfully thin with 2 long, narrow arms that were longer than even Marcus's arms.
Well, the imp said it was an elite force, so maybe it's just another band of murder hobos.
Loud booms resonated throughout the halls and into the room. They sounded deep, heavy, and solid. Patrick, a rainbow-colored centaur, stamped his hooves.
That doesn't sound like a small band. It may not be an army, but I don't expect this to be over soon. After all, the boss gave us these.
He held up his sparkling, glittery bracers. Marcus reached up and touched his own special gift, a magical patch Andrew had given to him. Arcane tingling zapped from it to his mind, and from his mind, a pulsating orb kept blasting out in front of him. It wasn't anything anyone could actually see, but Marcus felt it. Not only that, Marcus felt the physical presence of the other 4 monsters in the room. It was like having small orbs prodding at the edges of his mind, whispering, "Over here." The last monster in the room was a large green-colored cat with jagged canine teeth and powerful muscles under its forest-like fur. Her name was Arlene. She didn't talk, but she certainly understood when Marcus spoke to her. Arlene wore a light pink collar. The room they stood in contained numerous long wooden barricades that came up to the bottom of Marcus's chest. Each of the barricades had been constructed with magic and were made from stuck-together wooden planks. They were about 2 feet thick, and they varied in lengths. They were positioned in the room to create a maze from the entrance to the room to the exit. Marcus and his comrades stood in the avenues of the maze. The others were completely concealed, but Marcus and Patrick were not, as they were larger creatures. A loud crunching of wood echoed throughout the room, followed by a tremendous cheer of voices.
Get ready!
Marcus maneuvered so he was close to the door, and he crouched down a little. His face and horns still peeked out over the top of the barricade, though. Niel, Katrina, and Arlene also positioned themselves in the maze. But Patrick remained in the far back. The gift he received from the boss had been designed for long-distance combat. The room became uncomfortably silent, especially in the wake of the collective voices moments before. Marcus stilled his breath and only took in muted intakes and exhales when he needed it. A strange tugging prodded at Marcus's senses, and an aura of swirling colors stepped into the room. It didn't surround anything, or rather, it didn't appear to, but Marcus still saw the presence. The aura moved slowly into the room and lingered in the front door. It waited, and then it started to move closer to Marcus. Rather than wait, Marcus roared out and then sidekicked the middle of the aura. His hoof hit something solid.
What is it? Are they here?
The aura hunched over a little, and Marcus punched at it over and over. He missed a couple of times as the aura shifted about, but his fists collided with something. A moment later, 3 murder hobos stepped into the room, and they all looked at Marcus with angry eyes. They all wore the same kinds of outfits, bright blue and white tabards with a symbol of a golden index finger pointing upward on the front. One of the hobos wore heavy plate armor and wielded a fine, 2-handed bastard sword. He also had a full helmet, where only a small sliver of his face was visible. The second hobo had a bow and arrows and wore a light-armored version of what the first one did. She also wore a full helmet. The last person carried a long, narrow spear with a slithering spearhead. Marcus kicked the aura once more and it fell over to the ground. The hobo with the sword stepped up and swung his sword in sharp, twisting arcs. Marcus blocked the blade with his chain bracers, and he dodged as well. This hobo wasn't like any other dregs that he had fought in the past. His strikes were expertly timed, and he followed up with slice after slice. Marcus could only block and dodge. An arrow nearly missed his cheek, and Marcus started backstepping. Just over the swordsman's shoulder, Marcus saw the other two. The archer drew another arrow, and the spearman was trying to climb over the barricade, perhaps to try and flank Marcus. Just as the spearman managed to throw his leg over the top of him, a pumpkin-sized, sparkling ball slammed into his face. It exploded in a massive display of pink, blue, and purple glitter, completely covering his eyes, armor, and it even sprayed on the back of the archer. The spearman screamed, and when he tried to rub his eyes free, blood streamed down his face. Marcus's back touched the solid of the wall, and yet he continued to dip, bob, weave, and block. The swordsman increased his frenzied assault, and Marcus did his best to keep up with the pace. The constant sounds of metal against metal rang in his ears. Another glitter ball blew up beside the archer. Although she managed to turn away from it, it covered the back of her neck and the quiver. She reached back to pull another arrow from the quiver, but then she retracted her hand. Blood covered her fingers, and little shards of glitter sparkled within her wounds.
Mage in the back! Go for him first!
The spear wielder felt his way out of the room and then left. 3 more armed hobos came in as soon as he was gone, and they openly glared at Patrick. Another glitter bomb exploded on them. Subsequently, they screamed and then also left. Niel hopped on top of the barricades and leapt across them as if they were rooftops. He landed beside the archer and then pulled back his scythe. The archer's eyes widened, and then she drew another arrow, despite the danger. She winced, but still knocked the arrow, despite the blood dripping on the bowstring and the arrow shaft. The scythe bit into the side of her neck as she pulled back the arrow. A moment later, she let it go. The arrow pierced Niel's stomach.
By all the hair on my grandpa's balls.
He grunted and then stepped up closer to where Marcus and the swordsman fought. Niel swung from above and then caught the hobo in the back of the neck, cutting at a downward angle. The swordsman dropped a moment later. 3 more murder hobos stepped into the room. The one in front carried a wand, no helmet, but instead wore a circlet with a blue bead in the middle of his forehead. He waved his hand, and an opaque blue wall of energy formed over the first barricade, going from the surface to the ceiling. A ball of glitter exploded against the side of the energy, and it coated the area in glitter. The hobos were unaffected.
Fall back!
He snapped the arrow shaft so only a small stick jutted from his stomach. A moment later, he hopped along the barricades and then down behind one of them. Before the new hobos could get to him, Marcus vaulted over one of the barricades. He found himself on the other side of Arlene, who was crouched and poised to strike. She was now the monster in front, and to get to them, the hobos would have to run the length of the room. Patrick kept throwing balls of glitter at the path the hobos had to take. Each of the glitter bombs exploded and then covered the tops of the hobos' heads. Sometimes they got in people's eyes, or their skin, and the hobos would reactively rub them into their skin, trying to remove the covering. More adversaries came into the room, and dread soaked Marcus's stomachs. There were 15 people in the room, plus at least 30 out of view. Archer hobos kept popping up from the barricades, and they aimed at Patrick. Unfortunate hobos caught glitter bombs in the face, but a lucky arrow caught Patrick in the center of the throat. He went down a moment later. One of the hobos rounded the corner, and Arlene pounced upon him. Her teeth and claws dug into the man's armor, as if it were made from lunch meat. She tore her head back and then dove back in. The man screamed, and when he tried to stab her, the pink collar glowed. The blade passed right through her, and she kept rending and swiping. Other hobos stabbed at her, and like before, the pink collar glowed. Her flesh took on ghost-like features when the weapons struck or stabbed into her. Katrina stepped up to Marcus.
Cover me, and I'll take out that collection of archers.
Marcus nodded and then vaulted over the barricade at the same time as the metal woman. He landed on a hobo, crushing the poor fool beneath his massive weight. Other hobos turned on him and struck out, but Marcus blocked, parried, and dodged. All the while, he also slammed his hooves into the prone hobo's face and neck. Katrina slipped between the archers, and she struck them in the faces with her hammers. Her body was so thin and nimble that she easily weaved between their attempts to cut her with their own blades. Her hands moved quickly, and the hobos were not able to follow the trajectory of her weapons. As soon as the last archer was dead, Katrina rolled back over the barricade, safe from further attacks. Marcus punched, kicked, and even drove his horns into hobos around him. They died, and then he picked up their oozing corpses. He tossed them into a pile in the middle of the pathway. Arlene moved up to him, her fur covered in crimson paint. Marcus took her kills and also tossed them into the pile. The murder hobos collected on the other side of the pile, and they started trying to pull their comrades away. Katrina had propped herself up between two of the barricade walls by planting a foot on each of the walls, about a foot up on either side. She slapped at the hands of the hobos when they tried to grab one of their dead friends. Marcus also punched at them, keeping them from dismantling the pile. A brilliant beam of energy nearly roasted Katrina's face, and so she ducked back behind cover. The mage who made the barrier stood behind his comrades, and he pointed a palm toward Marcus. A moment later, a massive concussive force slammed into him and Arlene. They both collided against the wall. Marcus's head swirled as he rose to his hooves. The hobos had already dragged half of the bodies off of the pile.
Let's fall back.
Instead, Arlene leapt in front of Marcus. A dazzling beam struck her side. For a moment, Marcus saw her bones, illuminated as if they were made from torches, and her flesh had become transparent. She fell to the ground, lifeless. Marcus started to move ahead, but Katrina yelled,
No! Fall back!
He managed to dip around the corner as another beam struck the wall where once he stood. Marcus kept low, and as he made it around the corner of the next bend, he saw 4 hobos chasing him. He pivoted as soon as he got around the corner and balled his fists. When a hobo rounded the corner, Marcus crushed his face. The man fell back, and Marcus sidekicked him in the face where he had planted his fist. As he pulled his hoof back, glitter coated the man's nose and eyes. A quick glance revealed that the bottom of Marcus's hooves had been covered in sharp glitter. He focused on kicking, and made sure to deliver savage blows to vulnerable spots, like exposed necks or faces when he could. Katrina screamed behind him, and so Marcus looked behind him. The mage had extended his hand over the wall of the barricade, and molten lava poured from the hobo's palms. Lava pooled at Katrina's feet, and she had fallen to her knees in the lava. Marcus grabbed her by the shoulder, flung her over the top of the next barricade, and then leapt over himself. Katrina landed on top of Patrick's body. The centaur's eyes were still opened, locked in a glimmer of horror. Blood no longer pooled out of his body. Marcus reached over and closed the centaur's eyes. Niel knelt down beside Katrina and he looked at her wounds. The bottom of her feet and her shins were melted, like candle wax. When she tried to stand, she fell back to the ground.
Hey, if we prop you up, can you still go for their knees?
Katrina winced and then nodded. Marcus leapt on the other side of the pair of them and uppercutted a hobo as he rounded a corner. Niel's scythe chopped down and caught a man in the top of the head. The dwarf had leaned Katrina against his body, and he still swung at the hobos with his upper arms. Marcus stood beside him, and he blocked, punched, and kicked when he could. Katrina's long arms whipped forward and struck the lower legs of the hobos, which allowed the other 2 to deliver savage blows. Hobo bodies piled up in front of them.
Behind you!
Niel turned his attention back for a moment, just to see the mage reach his hand over once more. Lava started to flow out like water from a faucet. Marcus picked up Katrina and cradled her to his chest. Her arms whipped about in a frenzy, and it caught several of the hobos in the neck, face, and arms. At the same time, Niel jumped up and landed on the top of the wall.
Die!
He plunged the tip of the scythe into the temple of the mage. As a reward, 3 hobos stabbed him in the ribs, chest, and stomach. The light faded from Niel's eyes, and he fell into them. Marcus had propped himself up on the 2 walls, and he carefully walked back against the walls, avoiding the lava below. Katrina kept swinging at the hobos in front of her. Arrows zipped past Marcus, and panic flurried on his chest. He hopped down as one of the arrows nicked one of his horns. The arrowhead glanced off of it, but still, the Minotaur almost pissed himself a little. An archer rounded the corner, pulled back an arrow, and then let it loose. Katrina gasped and then fell limp in Marcus's hands.
No!
Marcus turned back and ran. An arrow sliced open his shoulder, but it plunged into the wall beside his face. He cradled Katrina in his arms, and then he left the room. Marcus sprinted down the hall toward the next room's door. A monster stared at him from the cracked doorway. As Marcus approached, the monster opened it up, and then slammed it once Marcus was inside. Other monsters placed wooden planks against the door, and started nailing them to the wall. The room was fairly open, and 10 monster comrades stood within it. Marcus laid Katrina down and looked down at her. Her eyes were closed, and her chest was still. An arrow had struck her 3 inches above her belly button.
Marcus!
Marcus looked up to see the pixie, Avery.
What are you doing here? I thought you were A-ranked.
I am, but I was sent to see how bad it was.
Other monsters gathered around while a few more pressed against the doorway with their weight.
How bad is it?
A Cyclops woman asked.
Pretty bad.
Marcus stepped away from Katrina's body and then stared at the doorway. Many auras flickered beyond the door.
There were at least 30 hobos who assaulted the room.
30? Holy shit, this is more serious than we anticipated.
The wooden door cracked.
Get away from there! They're coming through!
Avery fluttered down and started waving their hands. All of the monsters in the room became invisible.
Shouldn't you go warn the others?
An unseen voice replied.
They'll figure it out. Be ready, everyone. I'll maintain the spell as long as I can.
The door buckled in on itself, and the hobos swelled inside like floodwaters.